The bar went quiet in the specific way bars go quiet when something has been said that everyone heard and nobody expected. Not the hush of shock, exactly. More the held breath of a room, deciding what the moment means. What I had said was not complicated. It was not a speech. It was one sentence, directed at a man who thought he had been funny, on behalf of a woman who had said nothing because she had spent her whole life being more composed than the rooms she walked into deserved. What I had said was, "You've just told this entire bar that your best move in life is making someone feel small for something they didn't choose. I think we both know which one of you has the problem." The man said nothing. The bar stayed quiet. And beside me, Priya Anand set her glass down very carefully, turned her head in my direction and said, "That was either very kind or very stupid." I said, "Probably both." She said, "I appreciate both." That was the beginning. My name is Declan Shaw. I'm 35. I teach secondary school history in a city I moved to 6 years ago for a job I intended to stay in for 2 years and have not left, which I think says something about inertia and also about the fact that the job turned out to matter more than I expected it to. I am not, by temperament or practice, a person who makes scenes in bars. I am a person who notices things and takes a long time to respond to them, which my students interpret as patience, and which is more accurately described as the processing delay of someone who grew up in a house where the right response to most things was to wait and see. The night in question was a Thursday in October. A colleague named Pete had organized a pub quiz at a place called The Anchor, the kind of bar that has been there long enough to feel like a fact of the neighborhood, with tables that don't match, and a quiz host who takes it more seriously than the participants. There were 8 of us from the school, split into 2 teams of 4, and Pete had decided. Because Pete was the kind of person who made decisions on behalf of other people and called it organizing, that we needed a tiebreaker format. If the scores were level after round 5, one person from each team would be paired with someone from the other team and asked a sudden death question together. Pete had also, apparently, invited 2 people from outside the school. One of them was his friend Marcus. The other was Marcus's friend Priya, who arrived 10 minutes into the first round, apologized quietly to no one in particular for being late, found the chair someone pulled out for her with the calm accuracy of someone who has spent a long time understanding space by means other than sight, folded her white cane and hooked it over the back of the chair, and took off her coat. I was sitting 2 seats down. I noticed the cane. I noticed the way she found the table's edge with one hand and then moved with the specific confidence of someone who does not need to perform uncertainty. I noticed that she ordered a lime and soda when the server came, that she laughed at the quiz host's first joke before most of the table did, a beat earlier, which meant she was listening in a way the rest of us weren't, and that she knew the answer to the geography question in round 2 that nobody else at our table got. I did not speak to her directly in the first 4 rounds. She was on Pete's team. I was across the table. We existed in proximity, and I was aware of her in the way you're aware of certain things. Not loudly, not obtrusively, just present in the peripheral attention in a way that registers without announcing itself. The scores were level after round 5. Pete stood up to explain the tiebreaker. This is when I understood that Pete had planned something he thought was entertaining. He said, "Sudden death. 1 question. 1 pairing. First to answer wins." He paused. He looked across the table with the expression of a man about to deliver a joke he'd been holding. He said, "Deck, you're up." And he gestured at Priya with a kind of deliberateness that wanted the table to follow. "I thought we'd give you a challenge." He was smiling. Marcus was smiling. The smile had a shape I did not like. The implication was not subtle. The pairing was presented as a handicap. The joke, if you could call it that, was that being paired with a blind woman was a disadvantage that was also, in Pete's reading, inherently amusing. He had not said anything explicit. He didn't need to. The smile said it. Marcus's laugh said it. Two other people at the table smiled the uncertain smile of people who weren't sure if they were supposed to. Priya's expression did not change. This is what I mean about composure. She had heard it. She had heard everything. She was listening more carefully than anyone in the room, and her face simply held steady, the way a wall holds when something hits it, and the wall is built well enough to absorb it without showing the impact. It was the composure that did it, not the cruelty, though the cruelty was real. The composure. The evidence of how many times she had been in some version of this room, absorbing some version of this particular quality of stupidity, and it held steady because the alternative was giving the stupidity more than it deserved. I said, Pete. Pete was still smiling. He said, "What?" I said, "You've just told this entire bar that your best move in life is making someone feel small for something they didn't choose. I think we both know which one of you has the problem." The bar went quiet. Pete's smile didn't disappear immediately. It did the slower thing, the gradual retreat of an expression that has lost its audience, pulling back by degrees until what was left was just a face that didn't know where to look. Marcus said something low and dismissive. Nobody responded to it. The quiz host, with the professional instincts of a man who has seen many awkward silences and knows when to move, said, "All right, sudden death question. Ready?" I said, "Ready." I looked toward Priya. She was looking in my direction, not at me, exactly, but oriented toward me, her face turned slightly. She said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "You didn't have to do that." I said, equally quiet, "I know." She said, "Okay." The question was about the year the Channel Tunnel opened. Priya answered it in approximately 1 second. Flat, precise, no performance. 1994. The quiz host confirmed it. Her team won. She did not celebrate. She just nodded once. The small nod of someone who knew the answer and had known it, and that was sufficient. Pete bought around. He did not look at me while he did it. At some point in the following half hour, the table reorganized the way tables reorganize when the social weather has changed. People shifting, conversations splitting. The natural dispersal of a group that has had a moment and is now moving past it. I ended up in the seat beside Priya. She said, "History teacher." I said, "Pete told you?" She said, "You knew that Channel Tunnel answer too. I heard you start to say it." I said, "You were faster." She said, "I've been storing that answer for about 15 years. I have no idea why. Some facts just lodge." I said, 1994 is a good year. Lots of useful facts." She said, "Mandela, the Channel Tunnel, Pulp Fiction." I said, "You've categorized them." She said, "I categorize most things. It helps." I said, "With what?" She said, "With navigation. If you can't rely on certain kinds of information, you compensate with others. I know a very unusual amount of historical trivia." I said, "You came to the right table." She said, "I'm aware of the irony." She picked up her lime and soda. She had a way of finding things on a table that was entirely unhurried. A slight extension of her fingers, contact, location confirmed, then the action. No fumbling. No performance of difficulty, just a different sequence. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you say it?" I said, "Because it needed saying." She said, "People think things like that all the time without saying them." I said, "I know." She said, "So why you?" I thought about this. I said, "Because I was looking at you when he said it." and I saw what it cost you not to respond. And it seemed like the wrong distribution of effort, that you were spending energy absorbing something that should never have been directed at you. She was quiet for a moment. Her fingers were still on her glass. She said, "That's a very careful way to put it." I said, "I'm a history teacher. I spend most of my time explaining why things happened. It's made me think in terms of cause and distribution." She said, "And who bears the cost of things?" I said, "Yes, exactly that." She said, "The answer is usually the people who were already paying more." I said, "Yes, exactly that also." She turned her glass once. She said, "I have a rule about people who do things like what you did tonight." I said, "What's the rule?" She said, "I buy them a drink and then I find out if they're interesting. Because in my experience, people who notice the right things are usually worth talking to, and I've wasted too much time on people who don't." I said, "That's an efficient system." She said, "I run a lot of efficient systems." She signaled the server with the ease of someone who has figured out how to make her presence known in a room without needing eye contact. She ordered me a drink. She asked what I wanted first, which I noted, and then she turned back and said, "Tell me something you find genuinely interesting. Not small talk interesting. Actually interesting." I said, "Are we skipping the small talk?" She said, "I find small talk expensive. I have to work harder at the visual cues people use to fill conversational gaps, so I prefer to just talk." I said, "All right." I find it genuinely interesting that the way we remember historical events is almost always shaped by whoever decided the story first. Not what happened, who told it. And the first teller is almost never the person the event happened to. She said, "Say more." I said, "Most history is the account of observers and administrators. The people closest to the actual event, the ones bearing the cost of it, as you put it, those accounts come later, if at all. And by the time they do, the shape of the story is already set, and the later accounts get read as supplements rather than corrections." She said, "That is genuinely interesting." She said, "I study linguistics, specifically how language shapes the experience of space and navigation for people with visual impairment. I've been doing it for 6 years, and I'm still finding things that surprise me." I said, "Like what?" She said, "Like the way sighted people describe location in absolute terms. It's on the left. It's at the end. And the way those instructions fail completely when you've come from a different direction. Because left and end are relative to a viewpoint the speaker assumes everyone shares. And the way most designed environments are built on that same assumption. The whole world is narrated by the first tellers." I said, "The first tellers." She said, "You see what I did?" I said, "I saw it immediately." She said, "That's the second thing I've noticed about you." I said, "What's the first?" She said, "You don't perform. You just talk. Most people perform. They do the thing they think talking to me requires. Either they over-explain everything visually, or they try to pretend I'm exactly the same as everyone else, which I'm not. I just have different information. You just talked." I said, "You're a linguist." I figured overcorrection would be more annoying than just being a person. She said, "Correct. You are now at 2 for 2. The bar had settled back into its usual noise. Pete and Marcus were at the far end of the table having a conversation I couldn't hear and wasn't interested in. The quiz host was packing up his papers. Priya and I were at the corner of the table, and the corner had become its own room. She said, "I have another question." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "What did you think when you saw the cane?" I said, "Honestly?" She said, "That's what I'm asking for." I said. I thought, she knows exactly where she is. I was watching you find the chair, and it was the most purposeful movement in the room. Everyone else was shuffling and apologizing for their coats, and you just arrived, and I thought, she's done the work on every room before she's in it. She was quiet. The quieter kind of quiet. The kind with something happening in it. She said, nobody's described it like that before. I said, how do people usually describe it? She said, capable, mostly, independent. The language of low expectations politely exceeded. You described it as work. It is work. It's a significant amount of invisible work, and most people don't see it. I said, you see, sorry, you know what I mean. She said, don't apologize for that. People apologize for see and look and watch around me, and it's exhausting. The words are fine. I said, duly noted. She said, I mean it. If you spend the next however long self-editing every visual metaphor, I'm going to find that more tiring than the thing you're trying to avoid. I said, the next however long. She said, I'm assuming this conversation isn't ending at last orders. I said, is it a good assumption? She said, I have a very accurate model of when conversations want to continue. This one does. I said, you're right. She said, I know. The bar called last orders at 11. The group began the dispersal ritual, coats, phones, the debating of night buses. Pete said something in my direction that was shaped like an apology and didn't quite arrive as one. I acknowledged it without investing in it. Marcus had already gone. Priya unfolded her cane. She did it with one hand, a practiced extension, the kind of movement that has been done 10,000 times and requires no attention. She stood and put her coat on and said, I'm going to get a cab. Do you want to share one, or are you going another direction? I said, I can go another direction. She said, that's not what I asked. I said, then no, I don't want to go another direction. She said, good. We waited outside. October had turned cold, the specific cold that arrives after 10 p.m. and means it. She had her cane in one hand and her phone to her ear with the other, the cab company, giving an address in a calm voice. The voice of someone who has done this particular navigation many times and found the most efficient path through it. She hung up. She said, 8 minutes. I said, can I ask you something? She said, yes. I said, the cane, you fold it when you sit down. She said, I don't need it when I'm sitting. It's a mobility aid, not a simple. I said, I know that's not. I was going to say that every time I've watched you put it down, it looks like setting something aside, like the work is done for that part and now you can just be. She was quiet for a moment. She said, yes, that's exactly what it is. She said, you're 3 for 3, Declan. I said, I'm counting. She said, I know you are. The cab came. She found the door handle before I could have been useful, which I think she did partly because she could, and partly because she had correctly read that I might try to help, and had decided to preempt me gracefully. I got in from the other side. We dropped her first. Her building, a street I noted. She got out and turned back and said, I'm going to send you my number. Don't make it weird. I said, I won't make it weird. She said historians are sometimes weird about things they find interesting. They over-research. I said, I'll restrain myself. She said, a little research is fine. She went inside. The cab pulled away. The driver, without being asked, said, nice woman. I said, yes. He said nothing else, and I was grateful for it. She texted the number from the curb before I got home. No message, just the number. Then, 2 minutes later, 1994, since you were going to look it up anyway. I had not been going to look it up. I had known it. But I liked the assumption. I said, I knew it. I was being polite. She said, I know. I was testing. I said, "Did I pass?" She said, "You're not supposed to ask that." I said, "Am I supposed to wait?" She said, "Yes." "Good night, Declan." I told my mother about Priya in January. Over a phone call, I had not planned to be about Priya, and which became entirely about Priya, because my mother is a woman who can locate the significant thing in a conversation by echo, the way certain people navigate by sound. My mother said, "She corrected you about the cane?" I said, "The first week." She said, "And you listened?" I said, "Of course." She said, "I like her already." I said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you." The months had a shape I will try to describe accurately. We were not reckless. We were two people who had understood each other quickly and were taking the time to be sure the understanding was real and not just the projection of an interesting evening. She came to know my flat, the bookshelves, the papers on the kitchen table, the particular quality of the quiet I kept. I came to know hers, smaller, more organized, every object in a location that had been chosen rather than defaulted to. A place where space had been thought about, where the arrangement of a room was functional in ways mine wasn't, and instructive in ways I kept noticing. She had strong opinions about what constituted adequate preparation for anything. She had strong opinions about narrative, who told a story and from where, and what the telling omitted. She read extensively, audiobooks mostly, with occasional print for things she wanted to annotate. And she annotated in a braille note-taker she kept on her desk and which she called, without effect, her external brain. I sat in her kitchen in February while she listened to something. She used headphones when I was there, a consideration I had asked her not to make, and which she continued making in a smaller way, one ear free, and watched her pause and type a note and unpause, and I thought, this is what it looks like when someone has spent a long time building systems that actually work. Not workarounds. Systems. There's a difference. I told her that, later, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Most people see the systems as the interesting part. They find the adaptation interesting. You find the person who built them interesting." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's not a small distinction." I said, "I know." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She said, "I have been trying to decide when to say something for about 3 weeks." I said, "Say it." She said, "I love you." That's the something. No preamble, no contingency, just the sentence, placed on the table between us like an object she had been carrying and had decided to put down. I looked at her, at the precise way she was facing me, the slight angle that meant she was listening with her whole attention, and I thought about the bar in October. The white cane folded over the back of the chair, the composure that absorbed the room's stupidity so the room didn't have to. I thought about the first tellers and who bears the cost. I thought about a woman who had built working systems in a world designed by people who assumed a viewpoint she didn't share, and who had still found time, in the middle of all that, to be the most interesting person in every room she walked into. I said, "I've known for a while. I didn't want to say it before you were ready." She said, "How long?" I said, "The Channel Tunnel." She said, 1994? I said, "You answered it in 1 second and then you just moved on. No performance." And I thought, she doesn't need anyone to make a thing of what she knows. She just knows it. That's the rarest version of confidence I've ever been in a room with. She said, "You're going to make it difficult to maintain any kind of composure." I said, "Is that all right?" She said, "It's more than all right. Come here." I moved my chair around the table. I sat beside her. She put her hand out and I took it, and she found my face with her other hand, both palms brief, reading something. And then she settled. She said, "I know what you look like, for what it's worth." I said, "What do I look like?" She said careful, like someone who has been waiting a long time to be in the right room. I said, that's accurate. She said, I have a very accurate model. I said, I know. The cane still hooks over the back of the chair. I have never moved it, never touched it without reason, never made a moment of it. It is hers. It is functional. It is none of my business except when she asks me something practical, a new route, a description of a place we're going, the layout of a room before we arrive. I have gotten better at descriptions. She has told me so, which is the only metric I trust. She told her colleague Ria about me in March. Ria apparently said, a history teacher? And Priya said, he knew the Channel Tunnel answer. Ria said, that's your bar? And Priya said, that's not the bar. The bar is that he said it to himself, quietly, because he'd already looked it up before we met, and he didn't lead with it, and when I got there first, he just let me have it. She told me that story in April. I said, I wasn't going to lead with trivia. She said, I know. That's the point. Years later, when people ask, and it comes up, because the pub quiz story has the shape of a story people want to hear, she says, he said one sentence, and the whole bar went quiet. I say, she answered the tiebreaker in 1 second and didn't celebrate it. She says, that's not the story. I say, it's the part I remember. She says, the part you remember is the part where I was right. I say, the part I remember is the part where you already knew. You were just waiting for the room to catch up. She doesn't answer that. She does the thing she does instead, the slight turn of her head, the attention fully placed. Listening in the way she has always listened, more carefully than anyone else in the room, in the way that has always been, and will always be, the most purposeful thing in my vicinity. What would you have done if you were paired with someone as a joke, and realized, by the end of the night, that you were the one who'd been given something? And have you ever watched someone absorb a room's cruelty with more grace than the room deserved, and thought, that's the person I want to know? Tell me in the comments. If this one landed, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.